In the heart of suburban life lay a pristine neighborhood, characterized by manicured lawns and charming houses that seemed to echo the ideals of community living. This was a place where neighbors supposedly looked out for one another, but behind the picturesque facade lurked an undercurrent of tension, primarily orchestrated by the Homeowners Association, HOA. The HOA's role was meant to preserve property values and promote harmony, yet it often felt like an invisible hand that dictated every aspect of residents' lives. The rules were extensive: no unsightly lawn decorations, restrictions on fence heights, and even regulations on paint colors for homes. Each homeowner was handed a thick booklet outlining these guidelines, and adherence was monitored with a vigilant eye. As with many such associations, there existed individuals who took their responsibilities too seriously, individuals often dubbed HOA Karens. They were notorious for wielding their authority as if it were a badge of honor, ensuring compliance through intimidation rather than community spirit. Enter my neighbor, an archetype of the HOA Karen. She paid meticulous attention to the minutiae of neighborhood life, often lurking near her windows or patrolling the streets with a frown etched onto her face. Her self-appointed role as the enforcer of HOA standards made her both feared and reviled among residents. She had developed an impressive reputation for reporting infractions big and small. Whether it was a tree branch hanging too low or kids playing too close to her pristine flowerbeds, she seemed to derive pleasure from confronting anyone she deemed in violation of HOA decrees. My interactions with her had been minimal until the fateful day that would change everything. Until then, I had merely observed her antics from afar, witnessing her confrontations with others over trivial matters. But as fate would have it, our paths collided in a very personal way when I decided enough was enough regarding her overreach into my life. Sparks were about to fly in what began as an ordinary day in this seemingly idyllic neighborhood. The stage was set not just for an argument over property lines but for an explosive confrontation that would leave both our lives irrevocably altered, and all over a seemingly minor issue that quickly spiraled into chaos. It was a bright Saturday morning, the kind that beckons you to step outside and enjoy the breeze. I had just finished watering my lawn when I noticed her, the HOA Karen, standing on her porch, arms crossed tightly against her chest, her eyes narrowed like a hawk scanning its territory. The sun glinted off the freshly painted shutters of her house, reflecting the importance she placed on maintaining an immaculate appearance. In that moment, I felt an unsettling awareness creep over me. Something told me that my morning was about to take a turn I hadn't anticipated. As I bent down to prune some flowers at the edge of my property, I caught the faint sound of her voice, escalating from a murmur to sharp words directed at me. "Excuse me," she called out with an air of authority that brooked no argument. "Do you know your flowers are encroaching on my property line? That's a violation of HOA rules." I straightened up, gripping the gardening shears tightly. This wasn't our first tense exchange, but each time it happened, it took me by surprise. "They're well within my boundaries," I replied calmly, though irritation bubbled beneath the surface. She was always looking for something, anything, that could validate her role as the enforcer of neighborhood rules. Her demeanor shifted rapidly as she took a few determined steps toward me, narrowing the physical space between us. "You should really take a closer look at that property survey," she snapped, now visibly agitated. The more I maintained my composure, the angrier she seemed to get. In the heat of her indignation, she began gesturing wildly towards my flowers, drawing attention from passers-by who paused to watch this escalating drama unfold on our quiet street. It was as if she derived power from exhibiting her authority in front of an audience. The confrontation reached a boiling point when she crossed onto my lawn, pointing dramatically and accusing me of ruining the neighborhood's aesthetic, an accusation so far removed from reality it left me momentarily speechless. This was not just about flowers anymore, it was personal. As emotions flared and words flew back and forth like daggers, I could feel that this would evolve into something much bigger than our initial spat over minor landscaping issues. What began as a simple error in judgment over flower placement was quickly spiraling into a conflict far beyond anything either of us had expected. The seeds of conflict had been sown long before that fateful Saturday morning. My interactions with the HOA Karen had always been strained at best. She seemed to take pleasure in nitpicking even the smallest details of my property, seeking opportunities to flex her perceived authority. It started innocently enough, an innocuous comment about the color of my front door and whether it matched the HOA-approved palette, but quickly spiraled into a series of increasingly tense exchanges that permeated our neighborhood dynamics. In the weeks leading up to our confrontation, I had noticed her lurking around my yard more frequently, seemingly looking for any excuse to justify her incessant complaints. A loose brick in the walkway? An infraction. A stray leaf on her side of the fence? She was quick to point it out and demanded immediate attention. Each encounter added another layer of frustration, compelling me to wonder if she enjoyed creating drama as much as upholding neighborhood standards. The triggering incident occurred when I decided to plant a new flower bed along the border of my property. I had measured carefully, ensuring that everything was well within the legal limits of our property lines. What I didn't anticipate was her reaction when she discovered me digging up the soil. As I cleared the area and arranged the plants with care, she approached, eyes blazing with indignation. Her accusation came swiftly, "Those flowers are invading my space." In that moment, it became clear that this wasn't just an issue of flowers or property lines, it was about control. Her voice rose, laced with a sense of entitlement that made it impossible to have a rational discussion. I felt cornered, not just in a physical sense, as she stood mere feet away, but emotionally too, as if my boundaries were being disregarded entirely. I knew I had to put a stop to her overreach. I took a deep breath and decided that enough was enough. I was no longer going to let her dictate how I maintained my home. Summoning what little resolve I had left, I firmly yet politely informed her that she needed to leave my property. The moment those words left my lips marked a significant turning point, setting in motion a chain of events that neither of us could have predicted. The tension hung thick in the air as our disagreement escalated from mere words into something far more volatile. As I stood my ground, the tension in the air intensified, thick enough to cut. The HOA Karen's expression morphed from indignation to outright fury as she processed my refusal to back down. "How dare you speak to me like that? You think you can just do whatever you want on your property," she spat, her voice rising in pitch and volume. Each word dripped with disdain, as if my simple act of planting flowers was a personal affront to her authority. "I'm not doing anything wrong," I replied, trying to keep my tone level despite my rising frustration. "These flowers are well within my property line. You need to respect my space." My heart raced as I realized that this conversation was spiraling beyond mere words. It was becoming a battleground for our wills. Her face flushed crimson, and it was clear that the challenge had struck a nerve. "You don't understand how serious this is. If you keep pushing these boundaries, I will report you to the HOA, she threatened, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. In that moment, her emotional response was palpable. She felt cornered, and her need to assert dominance over our shared space drove her into a frenzy. I could see that her pride was at stake. She thrived on being seen as the gatekeeper of neighborhood standards. But instead of backing down, her aggression only fueled my resolve. "Go ahead," I replied defiantly. "I'm tired of being bullied by you and your ridiculous rules." With that retort, I watched as her frustration boiled over into an almost theatrical display of outrage. "You think this is a joke? You think you can just ignore the rules and ruin our neighborhood?" Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the anger she tried so hard to project. The sight of her flailing arms and frantic gestures drew attention from some neighbors who were now watching from their porches, adding fuel to the fire. As the spectators gathered, it felt like our confrontation had suddenly transformed into a public spectacle. What began as a private dispute over flower placement escalated into something much larger, a clash of wills played out before an audience that seemed both entertained and horrified by the unfolding drama. With every heated exchange, it became clear that this conflict would not be resolved easily, and I braced myself for the storm that lay ahead. As the verbal exchange reached a fever pitch, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. The onlookers, some with expressions of shock and others with barely concealed amusement, seemed to amplify our rising emotions. It felt like we were trapped in a tense play, and I was determined not to be the one to back down first. But then, everything changed in an instant. As I stood firm, insisting that she needed to leave my property, the HOA Karen's fury took a physical turn. Without warning, she lunged forward, shoving me with both hands as if she intended to push me off balance. The force of her attack caught me off guard. I stumbled back, arms flailing to regain my footing. My heart raced as adrenaline surged through my veins. Was this really happening? In a matter of seconds, the confrontation had gone from a war of words to an outright assault. It felt surreal as I registered the heat of her touch against my body and the shock on the faces of our neighbors watching from their yards. "You're crazy!" I yelled, instinctively raising my hands to shield myself. My mind was racing. How could someone so intent on enforcing rules cross such a dangerous line? The initial shock evolved into anger as I regained my balance and confronted her again. "You can't just assault someone because you disagree." As she stepped back momentarily, recalibrating her approach in response to my words, I could see her expression shift from fury to something almost desperate, like she had crossed a line she didn't know existed. But instead of backing down or apologizing for the outrageous behavior, she merely scowled and squared her shoulders defiantly. The physical altercation had left me shaken but also emboldened. It was clear that this wasn't just about flowers or property anymore, it was about asserting my right to exist peacefully in my own home without fear of intimidation. Yet beneath that determination lay a thread of unease. How far would she go next? In that moment, it became painfully evident that this conflict was not going to end easily for either of us. With neighbors still watching closely and tension still high, I braced myself for whatever might come next, knowing that her emotional state could erupt again at any moment. Little did I know that what followed would bring even more chaos into our lives. As I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, I realized that the situation had escalated beyond what I could handle on my own. The shock of the physical altercation still lingered in my body, leaving me feeling vulnerable and unsettled. The adrenaline that had surged through me was now giving way to waves of fear and uncertainty, fear about how far she might go next and uncertainty about whether my home, once a sanctuary, had turned into a battleground. In the aftermath of her attack, the decision to call the police crept into my mind with a mix of dread and necessity. I couldn't just let this incident slide. It was important not only for my safety but also for setting a precedent in the neighborhood. If I didn't take action now, what would stop her from thinking she could continue to cross boundaries without consequence? I felt an overwhelming need to assert that this behavior was unacceptable. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone, dialing 911 even as a nagging doubt tugged at me. Did this really warrant police involvement? She was my neighbor after all. Were we not supposed to resolve our issues within the community? A part of me worried that calling law enforcement would escalate tensions further and paint me as the villain in this narrative. Yet another part felt empowered, recognizing that it was crucial to protect myself and establish that violence is never an appropriate response to conflict. As the operator answered, I struggled to compose my thoughts. "I need help," I said, trying to convey both the urgency and gravity of the situation. The words spilled out as I recounted the altercation, detailing how she had assaulted me over a dispute about flowers, a seemingly trivial matter that had exploded into chaos. The operator's calm demeanor helped ease my mounting anxiety slightly, but I knew that law enforcement's arrival would bring a new layer of complexity to an already charged situation. When the police finally arrived, their presence felt both reassuring and daunting. Part of me sought their help, while another part feared that this incident would only widen the rift between neighbors instead of offering resolution. Regardless, I reminded myself why I made this choice: no one should feel endangered in their own home. As I braced for their questions and the fallout that might follow, I knew deep down that standing up for myself was the first step toward reclaiming my peace in this place that should have felt safe. The blaring siren of the police car echoed through the quiet neighborhood as two officers arrived on the scene, their presence instantly commanding attention. I stood at the edge of my property, still reeling from the confrontation, as they stepped out of their vehicle and assessed the situation. One officer, a tall man with a calm demeanor, approached me while his partner, a woman with a no-nonsense attitude, moved toward the HOA Karen, who was pacing back and forth on her porch. "Can you tell me what happened here?" the officer asked, his voice steady and reassuring. As I began to recount my version of events, how it had started with a dispute over flowers and escalated into an assault, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Would they take my side? Would they understand the emotional toll this incident had inflicted on me? Meanwhile, the other officer engaged with the HOA Karen, her expressions shifting from anger to indignation as she explained her side. "I was just trying to enforce community standards," she insisted, gesturing emphatically toward my flower bed as if it were evidence of some grave wrongdoing. "She was invading my space, and I simply confronted her." The officers listened carefully to both accounts, their expressions neutral but attentive. It was clear that they were experienced in handling neighborhood disputes like ours. They knew how to navigate the complex emotions at play. They asked questions to clarify details, such as whether there had been any previous warnings or exchanges between us before this incident. As I stood by waiting for them to finish their discussions, I could feel my heart racing again, this time not from fear but from anxiety about how this would all be resolved. Much to my surprise, the officers didn't immediately dismiss either viewpoint. Instead, they sought to mediate. Eventually, both parties were called together for a brief meeting with the officers present. "What we have here is a misunderstanding that escalated unnecessarily," one officer stated firmly yet diplomatically. "It's important for both of you to respect each other's boundaries moving forward." Despite feeling somewhat vindicated by having law enforcement acknowledge my right to defend my property, I couldn't shake off the tension that hung in the air like a thick fog. The HOA Karen's glare told me she wasn't finished yet. While this moment brought a temporary reprieve from chaos, it became all too clear that our battle was far from over. As I walked inside after the officers left, I wondered how this encounter would shape our neighborhood dynamics moving forward and whether peace was truly attainable at all. In the days following the incident, the atmosphere in our neighborhood shifted dramatically. Conversations with neighbors became a mixed bag of concern and gossip. Some approached me with support, expressing disbelief that things had escalated to such a physical confrontation over something as trivial as flowers. They shared their own experiences with the HOA Karen, revealing that I was not alone in feeling her overreach. Others, however, eyed me warily, perhaps wondering if I was the instigator in this unfolding drama. Despite having law enforcement present during the incident, my sense of security took a significant hit. I found myself double-checking locks and glancing nervously out the window whenever I heard footsteps nearby. The once comforting familiarity of my home transformed into a space filled with anxiety, where every noise seemed amplified and every shadow felt threatening. I realized how quickly a peaceful environment could turn hostile and how fragile that peace truly was. Adding to my unease was the looming threat of repercussions from the homeowners association. After all, this was the very entity that empowered the HOA Karen in the first place. In the days that followed, I received a notification from them regarding an upcoming meeting where they would discuss recent disturbances in our community. My mind raced with worries. Would they side with her? Would I be branded a troublemaker for standing up to her? The potential for sanctions weighed heavily on my shoulders. During this ominous week, I consulted a few trusted neighbors about attending that meeting together. They assured me that they would stand by my side, sharing their own grievances about the HOA's strict regulations and how they had felt bullied by the Karen in question. Their solidarity helped alleviate some of my fears but did little to quell the tension inside me. As I prepared to confront both my neighbor and the HOA at this meeting, I knew it was no longer just about flowers, it was about asserting my right to feel secure in my own home. Yet even amidst this collective strength, doubts lingered. Would our voices be enough to challenge her influence? As I braced myself for what lay ahead, I understood that reclaiming my peace would involve more than just standing up to one individual. It required a united front against an entrenched system that had long allowed intimidation to flourish unchecked. As the dust settled from the confrontation, the community began to react, revealing the complex tapestry of opinions and loyalties that existed within our neighborhood. For some residents, my stand against the HOA Karen was a source of inspiration. A few came forward, sharing their own stories of harassment and overreach by her. They expressed relief that someone had finally challenged her authority. Their support felt like a lifeline amidst the uncertainty I faced, bolstering my resolve as we discussed strategies for addressing our concerns at the upcoming HOA meeting. However, not all responses were supportive. A faction of neighbors rallied behind the HOA Karen, viewing her as a guardian of community standards rather than an enforcer of intimidation. Whispers began to circulate, and I could feel the tension thickening when I encountered them in common spaces, gathering at the mailboxes or during evening strolls. Their disapproving glances felt like daggers, and I sensed that many were eager to label me as the troublemaker in this narrative. These interactions left me feeling isolated, as if I had unwittingly stepped into a divide that had long simmered beneath the surface. At times, I would overhear conversations filled with snippets of gossip regarding my actions. Some claimed I had instigated the altercation while others thought I was simply being dramatic. It stung to know that even those who once seemed friendly now had reservations about me. This backlash made me question whether my fight for personal safety and peace was worth the potential alienation from my community. Despite these challenges, I remained focused on advocating for change within our neighborhood. During discussions with supportive neighbors, we shared ideas for fostering a more cooperative environment, one where open communication could replace intimidation tactics. We even considered proposing new community guidelines that emphasized mutual respect rather than strict adherence to antiquated rules that favored one voice over another. The upcoming HOA meeting loomed large in my mind. It became clear that this would be more than just a discussion about flowers or property lines. It would be a pivotal moment to redefine how we interacted as neighbors. As I prepared for what lay ahead, I recognized that standing together was our greatest strength in challenging not only the HOA Karen but also any entrenched attitudes that allowed such behavior to flourish unchecked. United, we could reclaim our neighborhood and restore it to a place where everyone felt safe and respected. Reflecting on the tumultuous experience with the HOA Karen, several important lessons emerged about standing up for oneself and navigating the complexities of neighborhood dynamics. First and foremost, I learned that asserting boundaries is not just a personal right but a necessity for maintaining one's peace and safety. The confrontation forced me to confront my fears head-on, realizing that allowing someone to overstep their bounds could have far-reaching implications, not only for myself but for others in the community struggling under similar pressures. Dealing with authority figures, particularly in a community setting governed by an HOA, requires a strategic approach. It highlighted the importance of understanding not just the rules that govern our neighborhoods but also the personalities behind those rules. The HOA Karen thrived on her perceived power and authority, yet it was essential for me to remember that I, too, had rights as a resident. This situation taught me the value of being informed and prepared. Knowledge is a powerful tool when confronting those who would seek to intimidate or control. Moreover, I discovered how pivotal it is to foster relationships with fellow neighbors. My support network was crucial during this ordeal. Standing together with other residents created a sense of solidarity that empowered us all. It underscored the idea that we are often stronger together than alone. Open communication among neighbors can pave the way for a more cooperative atmosphere, allowing us to address grievances without resorting to conflict. Navigating personal boundaries amidst neighborhood politics is no small feat, as my experience illustrated. It's essential to strike a balance between advocating for oneself while also considering how actions may impact broader community relations. I learned that diplomacy often works better than confrontation. Seeking common ground can help bridge divides that might otherwise fester into larger conflicts. As I look ahead to future interactions within my neighborhood, I understand that this journey has equipped me with resilience and insight. I feel more empowered to advocate for change while fostering an environment rooted in mutual respect and understanding. The lessons learned through this challenging experience will guide me in ensuring that my home remains a sanctuary, one where I can express myself freely without fear of intimidation or harassment from those who may disagree with me. Ultimately, reclaiming our neighborhood becomes not just about individual rights but about building a community that genuinely supports and protects its members.